Hi, class. Today's topic is literary modernism in the 20th century. So, modernism can be seen as a reaction to trauma. The years of the early 21st century were pretty rough worldwide. So, if you've studied history at all, you're aware that we had two world wars, World War One, World War Two. The US was a bit later getting into the wars, but Britain, which is the countries whose literature we're studying, were in both wars from the start. World War II was from 1914 to 1918, and they still today have a remembrance day for those who died in the war, and the symbol for that is red poppies. So German Zeppelins, like the Goodyear blimp more or less, began bombing Britain in 1915. So horror is taken to a whole new level when you look up in the sky, see a giant balloon, and it's raining bombs on you. It affects the human psyche. The draft in Great Britain, where they drafted soldiers into the Army and Navy, began in 1916. World War One is noted for trench warfare, which all war is horror, but trench warfare was new, and it meant living and fighting from trenches that were basically mud, rat infested, just horrific conditions to try to live in, much less get up and run out of and fight. Spanish flu, the epidemic was 1918 to 1920-ish, and worldwide, so many people died. We're all too familiar with worldwide pandemics now ourselves, but this one was especially challenging because it killed so many young people. The virus for this epidemic attacked people with the strongest immune systems and killed them in particular. So very heartbreaking. And, my family lost several family members during that time to the flu. Other deadly weapons were coming to the forefront: poison gas, artillery, machine guns, flamethrowers, tanks. So humankind was getting better at exterminating each other. Some works that came out of this: T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland. We're reading Proof Rock, which is a kind of like T.S. Eliot light, if you can imagine. Virginia Woolf was very prominent. One of her well-known works is Mrs. Dalloway. If you've ever seen the movie The Hours, that has a lot about Mrs. Dalloway in it. And if you're interested, that would be a good watch. Uh, George Orwell came out with 1984, and believe it or not, I'm old enough that I read 1984 before 1984 actually happened. So uh, we were all kind of wondering, well, is it going to really happen the way he played it out? And I would say parts of it did, but parts of it are actually happening now. So scary stuff. Take into account that modernism is not, there's not a definite beginning point, there's not a definite end point like most of our eras that we're discussing. But 1914 to 1950, 1960 are considered the time when it had held the most sway as a literary genre, I would say. More events behind the modernist movement: the Great Depression, as we called it here in the States during the 1930s. Worldwide, other countries called it the slump. And it created a worldwide situation where people lost jobs, they lost their homes, a lot of people starved, um, and it was especially tough, as things like this are, for the poorest people. So people that were already barely making it were in a really bad place for a decade or more. My parents remembered the Great Depression, and my mother said that we didn't really start coming out of it until the factories really ramped up for World War II. So that would have been in 1941. Uh, so it's hard to underestimate how much that affected things and in a way led to World War II. So infrastructure in the UK was deeply damaged by World War II. So they were getting bombed constantly. And, here we had the horrible events at Pearl Harbor, but in Britain, the Germans were sending bombers and more Zeppelins, and they even developed a rocket uh, that could send bombs to Great Britain. And, even after the war, you don't have a factory to go work in, you don't have a home, you don't have roads, the train tracks, bridges. They had bombed so much of Great Britain. If you ever have the pleasure to visit there, uh, which I have had, and our tour guide would look at so many places and say, well, that's new since the war because what was there before was destroyed. It's it was tough. Uh, and consequently, back to my second point here, around the world, there are ruins for people to try to rebuild while they're suffering shock, PTSD from the war. So very difficult. Rationing, uh, this can be hard for modern students to understand. You could not go to the store and get what you wanted, even if you had the money, because things were rationed. If you didn't have a coupon, you couldn't get the food item. My mother was a young teen. She had a coupon book. So she had a single mom, and they would, of course, pull their coupons and try to get things. And even if you did have the coupon, the store might be out of the item that you wanted. You had to stand in lines, and it was so much worse in Great Britain. They did not get fully away from rationing until 1954, and the war was over almost 10 years before that, because of so much loss to their infrastructure, the farms, farm machinery. It's just mind-boggling that it wasn't until the late 50s that you could be sure to go in a store and pretty much get what you wanted if you could afford to pay for it. Consequently, life did not feel normal for many decades. So you had World War One, the Depression or the slump, World War Two, and then the after effects of that trying to rebuild. Again, it's important to note that not all literature during this time period is going to have the same subject matter. It doesn't work that way, and I think that you've studied enough literature in high school and college that you understand this, but I just want to emphasize that a label is imperfect at best. A little bit more about the emotional fallout, because this ties in closely to modernism and the way modernist novels and poetry are written. So humans are trying to understand what happened, trying to deal with it. They can feel fragmented, disillusioned, alienated. They don't trust authority and want to rebel against it, because if the people that were leading us had done a good job, a lot of this would not have happened, right? We wouldn't have had two world wars almost back to back. Apocalyptic events, which were previously hardly conceivable, are revealed. The Nazi concentration camps, many people did not know or understand what was happening there during the war. Again, I'll go back to mom, and she says, yeah, she was young, but she said she didn't really know what had happened until she read the diary of Anne Frank, the young girl who was eventually who was in hiding in the Netherlands and was sent to a concentration camp. So after the war, when our GIs and others went and liberated the people that were surviving in the camps, then the horror and the extent of 6 million people being exterminated came to light. How do you deal with that? Nuclear weapons, again, uh, in my own history, when I was in elementary school, we did the duck and cover. We had drills where we would dive under our desks and, cover our heads as if that would help us in case of a nuclear bomb. So, and today we have school shootings, so that kind of gives us, unfortunately, an idea of what the panic of trying to prevent apocalyptic events might feel like. So, exploring individual consciousness becomes more important to some writers than outer reality, and that helped to promote the stream of consciousness technique, which, when it's done well, I think it's something that we almost don't even notice anymore when a writer uses it. But back then, when it was new, it was strange and hard for readers to understand sometimes. Here's some notable modernist works in the British Isles. Not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about this, but there they are. If you get a chance to read 1984 and Brave New World, it's worth it. It's tough, but it's worth it. And we are reading Prufrock, and if we had time, we would have read Mrs. Dalloway too. So modernism as a genre reflects on this trauma, these world events, and as we go past modernism into the places that we are now, which are arguably postmodernism, metamodernism, or some combination of the two. Uh, Modernism is still with us in ways that I think as you read more, you'll understand. Human consciousness has become changed by so many events, so many worldwide events. Some writers try to record some of these horrors for posterity or try to extrapolate what future horrors could be like. And again, it sounds like a rough subject, but so many of the series that I see on TV or the movies or whatnot are structured around an apocalypse. Uh, Other writers might look to fantasy. A lot of us are fans of The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and so on. Tolkien, if you look closely, a lot of the events in those works could be tied back to what happened during World War I and World War II. So we think that we're escaping into fantasy, but he's really schooling us about what can happen even when hobbits are not involved. So more stories are being told from points of view not often regarded as important previously. So we've been seeing this even in the Victorian era, that we start to see stories and poems told from the standpoint of more average people, people who work for a living. So that's a good thing to broaden the points of view, that we're not just hearing how upper class people or royalty live. And I'd have to say that our literature does incorporate this, and literature is never going to be the same after modernism and the events of the 20th century. It just can't, we can't go back to a place before that. And that's not always a bad thing. We need to learn from mistakes, or the mistakes cease to have meaning if we don't try to change things for the better. And change is inevitable. Literature trends can seem like the weather. Wait 5 minutes and they'll change, but that's keeps it interesting and keeps it worth studying. So thanks for bearing with me through modernism, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.